animal pray? Can a beast kneel down and worship the God of its masters? This is a look at unique images of the Civil War era and a discussion of dangerous thoughts about American slavery. In 1858, a child is born into slavery on a Virginia plantation. In a few short years, the plantation is engulfed by the fires and disruption of civil war. The plantation owners die, leaving behind their property, including the now 3-year-old slave Fanny. Catherine Lawrence is a Northerner and ardent abolitionist. During the war, she traveled south to volunteer as a nurse. At the Battle of Bull Run, Lawrence becomes the first nurse to administer anesthesia in the field. While Lawrence is serving in Northern Virginia, freed slaves at her hospital inform her of 3 children in need of rescue. They urge her to take charge of little Fanny and her 2 older sisters. Lawrence quickly places the 2 sisters in good homes, but she keeps Fanny, who as the youngest is the most vulnerable, and as the most Caucasian in appearance, the most marketable of the 3. One can clearly see why Fanny is different, for she is both a slave and clearly the child of the plantation owner. She is perceived as black, but presents and is treated as white. Catherine Lawrence agrees to adopt Fanny, who she describes in her memoir as an affectionate, appealing little girl. It is obvious that the spinster loves the child, but her abolitionist and Christian beliefs also recognize Fanny's potential as a prized tool of wartime propaganda. Lawrence proceeds to have Fanny photographed, an expensive and tedious procedure which a child would normally undergo only once or twice throughout the course of an entire childhood. Catherine Lawrence has Fanny pose for photographic portraits over 20 times in a 1-year period. Fanny becomes one of the most photographed human beings of the Civil War era. These photographs objectify Fanny, first as a piece of property, an unredeemed slave, with the status of a runaway horse or strayed piece of livestock, then as redeemed, freed from slavery, baptized as a Christian, so now a human being possessing a soul. Catherine Lawrence poses the child in various costumes emblematic of Union loyalty and the purity and innocence of a Christian girlhood. Lawrence does not have these photographs made for her own personal enjoyment or the historical record. She wants to gain attention for the abolitionist cause and understands that Northerners who view these photos will be shocked at the presentation of a light-skinned, light-eyed, blonde child as a piece of chattel. Clearly, Lawrence wants to force viewers to confront all the evils of slavery, not just the removal of physical freedom, but child exploitation, the loss of individuality, the absence of religious spirituality, sexual exploitation, and even the very issue of racial identity itself.
Hey, I'm Polly Byers. I am a costume designer, and I have some experience as a historian working for museums and so forth. I know a lot about costume history, and I did a master's thesis, the history of erotic costume, and a lot of that starts back in the Victorian era with children and adults, primarily females. So I would classify these as costumes, and they're made in such a way to accommodate the growth of the child. So she was probably anticipating a long period of time. Yeah. I find it interesting that so much detail is put on the hair, perhaps to make her appear whiter and less offensive if you will, I mean, for the period. And the abolitionists, who I know were really into, the whiter a child looked, the more they would accept it and find it horrifying that these children would have been slaves. But at the same time, the clothing, she would not have worn these dresses, which appeared to be made of silk, without undergarments. Mm-hmm. So you're getting sort of two mixed stories, but again, it wouldn't be offensive and shocking. It would be pleasing enough without being too shocking. You know, in this period for carte de visite, you would wear your Sunday best. Mm-hmm. You'd have a dress and you'd have your Sunday best. Very few women had a lot of things to wear, but in general, what I saw in all these pictures, I mean, they're costumes, and I would bet that she didn't wear them for anything else but if she was presented into public, if she was in these photographs, and other than that, who knows? I mean, she may have had just regular children's day clothes. Plus, children wore things that were easily cleaned, and these dresses would have all required intensive maintenance. So I'm guessing they were her little costume photo dresses.
After Fanny poses for the first photograph, Lawrence brings her to Plymouth Church in Brooklyn. Plymouth's pastor is Henry Ward Beecher. The younger brother of Harriet Beecher Stowe, he is the premier preacher in the abolitionist movement. Famous for his flamboyant sermons and lifestyle, Beecher enacts controversial redemptions of escaped slaves, melodramatic stagecraft, in which he replicates the process of a slave auction, urging his parishioners to bid on slaves, usually attractive young females, as they would on a slave at a trader's auction block. But rather than bid for ownership of a slave, congregants bid to purchase the slave's freedom, and thus her redemption. Redemption from physical bondage and from spiritual bondage, and ushered into a truly Christian life. All of the subsequent photographs of Fanny include the phrase, "a redeemed slave child." The term redemption has a double meaning. By paying money to a slave's owners, the slave becomes a freed man or woman and is liberated from physical bondage. Through baptism and the acceptance of Christ, the Savior, the freed man or woman receives Christian redemption. The former slave now has a soul and can look forward to acceptance into heaven.
I'm the Reverend Jan Nunley. I am an Episcopal priest in Peekskill, New York. Redemption in Christianity, of course, derives from its roots in Judaism. And the thing that you need to remember is that in the ancient world, slavery was not based on one's race. It was more based on one's circumstances. In other words, if war went badly or your personal economic circumstances required you to put yourself in a situation of indenture to someone else, then you were considered to be a slave. So in Christianity, now you have, deriving from, as I said, from Judaism, you have the tradition of Ruth and Boaz, the kinsman redeemer. You have in the book of Job, chapter 19, Job says, "I know that my Redeemer lives, and at the last he will stand upon the earth." So there's the idea of the Redeemer who redeems us from slavery. Slavery to sin is what's being assumed here. Mm-hmm. The idea of sin being separation from God. At the very literal level, it is a separation from the source of holiness, the source of purity, the source of good. God cannot endure the presence of evil, of bad, of sin. And so the presence of sin in human lives separates us from God. Well, who bridges the gap, then, between us and this holy God? That must be the Redeemer. We are enslaved to sin, and a Redeemer must come and pay the price to redeem us from sin, to redeem us from what enslaves us, and to restore us to relationship with God, the Holy One. So the remedy of the separation is is the Redeemer, and in Christianity, the idea is that God sends Jesus to take on the role of the Redeemer, and by his death, to destroy death which holds us in bondage, and then to free us from sin, to free us from death, and all the things that separate us from God.
Because of his choice of pretty young women and girls, Beecher's redemption auctions had a strong sexual undercurrent. Fanny, an apparently white child, presented to the congregation as an unredeemed slave, added a layer of forbidden sexuality to the proceedings. She was living proof of the sexual exploitation of female slaves by their white masters. Fanny is redeemed and is now seen as a Christian child with a soul, but remains a sensational symbol of the tragic mulatta, living evidence of the sexual and moral depravity of the South. Fanny's image becomes invaluable as an instrument of propaganda. What parents of the Union could look at this child and not wonder if the same fate could not befall their own child if such a thing could happen to Fanny?
To speak of a Christian as a soldier for Christ, there again, there's that great reversal. It's an ironic statement because it's speaking of a soldier for peace. Now, as time marches on, of course, and after Constantine and after it became acceptable to be engaged in the practice of war, we come up with the concept of just war. And so in the Victorian era, by that time, it's perfectly acceptable to be a warrior and to call oneself a Christian. And so the original irony that was in Paul's writings about being a soldier for Christ is completely lost.
It's propaganda. In this period too, and you find it in women's clothing, there was a jacket very popular for women called the Zouave jacket, which you know about the Zouaves, and it was adopted into popular fashion, modern, these little crop jackets that imitated the military clothing, and bullion braiding, epaulettes, and things like that, hats that also looked like military hats, and I think that all rallied the troops, and people at this period were so intense about the war and very patriotic.
Catherine Lawrence earns money by selling carte de visites of Fanny, noting her redemption and baptism by the famed Henry Ward Beecher. Beecher raises money for the Plymouth Church and the abolitionist movement, and raises his own profile even higher. Catherine Lawrence sees none of the money raised by Beecher, and speaks bitterly of being deaconed out of it. Close examination of Fanny's CDVs show costumes and poses dedicated to erasing her blackness and making her over into a palatable white child, one who would be embraced in a way a black child never could. Widely distributed throughout the Union during the Civil War. These images become a precursor to the use of female imagery in propaganda campaigns and posters created for World Wars I and II, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. After the war ended, Fanny faded into obscurity. Living out the story of the tragic mulatta, she became an outcast in both black and white society. By the time Catherine Lawrence published her biography in 1895, Fanny Virginia Cassiopeia Lawrence was dead, and ironically, there are no known photographs of her as an adult. The issues that poisoned Fanny's life still course through America's veins today. Just as we are still obsessed with race, Fanny is still a product to be sold and profited from. In 1863, she was used as a slave, profited from by the church and the abolitionist movement, and was a source of revenue for her adoptive mother. Today, reprints of her photographs lurk on eBay, and retail giant Sears sells framed pictures of her. But if her image haunts us as a vulnerable child, ill-used in life, it also inspires and informs us. For Fanny did make the transition from powerless slave to little drummer girl, and the drum she beat played the song of freedom.
Yes, if you want to say that I was a drum major, say that I was a drum major for justice. Say that I was a drum major for peace. I was a drum major for righteousness. And all of the other shallow things will not matter.